On Father's Day, my own son stood in front of 40 people, lifted a crystal wine glass, smiled like he was about to honor me, and said, "I wish you'd never been my dad." The laughter stopped so suddenly that I could hear the hummingbirds near the bougainvillea hedge. My granddaughter froze with a paper plate in her hands. My youngest grandson slowly lowered the little American flag he'd been waving. Even the grill seemed to go quiet. For a few seconds, no one breathed. I looked directly into my son's eyes. He was waiting for anger. Maybe shouting, maybe tears. He'd already decided I was the villain in whatever story he'd been telling himself. Instead, I stood up. I straightened the wrinkles from my navy polo shirt, smiled calmly, and said, "Then live as if you never had a father." I set my untouched drink on the patio table, walked past every stunned guest, picked up the keys to the black Porsche parked beside the driveway, and drove away. About 10 minutes later, while I was stopped at a red light on Scottsdale Road, my phone buzzed. "Ethan, bring my car back, or I'm calling the cops." I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because after everything I'd sacrificed to build the life he'd inherited, my own son still believed that Porsche belonged to him. It didn't. It never had. My name is Daniel Harper. I'm 63 years old, widowed, retired, and until that Father's Day afternoon, I would have told anyone that my greatest achievement wasn't building a successful business. It was raising my son. Turns out I was wrong about at least one of those things. I kept driving without answering Ethan's text. The Arizona sun reflected off the hood of the Porsche as I headed north toward Carefree Highway, leaving behind the celebration I'd paid for. I'd rented the catering, bought every steak, ordered the decorations. Even the custom Father's Day cake sitting untouched on the patio had been my idea. Funny how quickly a celebration can become a funeral. Not for a person, for a relationship. I pulled into a scenic overlook outside town and shut off the engine. For the first time all afternoon, the silence felt honest. I leaned back against the leather seat and closed my eyes. Memories have a strange habit of arriving when your heart finally gets tired of pretending everything is fine. I remember the tiny apartment where Ethan and I lived after his mother and I got married. Back then, we didn't have money. We had determination. I worked construction during the day. At night, I repaired air conditioning units out of our garage. Weekends belonged to customers who couldn't afford emergency service fees. There were years when I slept 4 hours a night. Every dollar mattered. Every opportunity mattered. My wife, Linda, used to tease me. One day, she'd say, "You're going to own the biggest HVAC company in Arizona." I'd laugh. I'd settle for paying off the truck. Somehow we managed both. Over the next 35 years, Harper Climate Solutions grew from one pickup truck into a respected regional company with more than 80 employees. We never became a billion-dollar corporation. We became something better, a company people trusted. The kind where technicians stayed 20 years because they knew I'd remember their kids' birthdays. The kind where customers asked for us by name. Success didn't arrive overnight. It arrived one repair, one contract, one honest handshake at a time. By then, Ethan was growing up, and because Linda and I remembered what it felt like to struggle, we promised ourselves he'd never have to. We paid for baseball camps, music lessons, a reliable used car when he turned 16, college without student loans. When he wanted to start a marketing company after graduation, I quietly guaranteed the bank loan. When the business struggled during its second year, I paid it off without telling anyone. When he proposed to Ashley, I paid for most of the wedding because I wanted them to begin their marriage without debt. I never kept score. Parents aren't supposed to. At least that's what I believed. After Linda passed away from pancreatic cancer 8 years ago, helping Ethan became my way of staying connected to her. She always believed family came before everything else. Sometimes I wonder if I misunderstood what she meant. Family comes before pride, not before accountability. Looking back now, I can see moments I ignored. Little comments, little assumptions. They seemed harmless at the time. If Ethan introduced friends to my lake house, he'd casually call it our family place. Then it slowly became my place. If someone admired the Porsche, he'd smile and say, "Yeah, I've always loved German engineering." He never actually claimed he bought it. He simply never corrected anyone. Eventually, people assumed it belonged to him. I heard it once at the country club. "Must be nice driving that Porsche." Ethan smiled. "It is." I stood 10 feet away. He never looked at me. I should have spoken up then. Instead, I convinced myself it wasn't worth embarrassing my son. That became a dangerous habit, excusing things because confronting them seemed harder. The Porsche itself had a simple story. I bought it 2 years after retiring, a retirement gift to myself. Linda had always laughed whenever one drove past. "If we ever make it," she joked, "you deserve one." She never lived to see me buy it. When I finally signed the paperwork, I cried in the dealership parking lot. Not because of the car, because she wasn't sitting beside me. A few months later, Ethan asked if he could borrow it for a charity gala. Of course, I said. Then another event, then weekends. Eventually, it became easier leaving it at his house because he asked so often. The title, registration, insurance, everything remained in my name. There was never any discussion about changing ownership because I never intended to. It was still my car. Always had been. Apparently, Ethan had rewritten that story in his own mind. Or maybe Ashley helped him. She had a talent for making temporary arrangements sound permanent. Someday it'll all be yours anyway. She'd often tell him when she thought I wasn't listening. Those words seemed harmless, until they weren't. My phone buzzed again. Another text. Final warning. I'm reporting the car stolen. I looked at the message for several seconds. Then I placed the phone face down on the passenger seat. If my son truly believed I had stolen my own Porsche, he was about to learn that reality doesn't bend itself around entitlement. A few minutes later, my phone rang. The caller ID read Scottsdale Police Department. I answered. Daniel Harper speaking. The officer's first sentence told me everything I needed to know. Mr. Harper, we've received a stolen vehicle report filed by someone claiming your Porsche was taken this afternoon. I quietly closed my eyes. Father's Day wasn't over. It was only beginning. Mr. Harper, we've received a stolen vehicle report regarding your black Porsche 911. The officer's voice was calm and professional. He wasn't accusing me of anything. He was simply doing his job. May I ask who's reporting it stolen? I said, though I already knew the answer. Your son, Ethan Harper. I looked through the windshield toward the desert mountains glowing under the late afternoon sun. For a long moment, I didn't say anything. The officer finally asked, Sir, I'm still here. Can you tell me whether you're currently in possession of the vehicle? I am. And do you have proof of ownership? I have more than proof. I have the original title, registration, insurance purchase agreement, and every maintenance record since I bought it. There was a pause. You bought it? Yes. Another pause. I'm sorry, Mr. Harper. The reporting party claimed the vehicle belongs to him. It doesn't. The officer cleared his throat. If you're willing, could you email us copies of the registration and insurance card? It'll save everyone a trip. I'll send them in 5 minutes. Thank you, sir. Before hanging up, he added something that stayed with me. I've handled a lot of family disputes. They usually aren't really about the car. No, I replied quietly. They're almost never about the car. 20 minutes later, I sat inside a small coffee shop near Cave Creek, sipping black coffee while forwarding every document the officer requested. The title listed one owner, Daniel Thomas Harper. No co-owner, no transfer, no lien, just me. I stared at the title longer than I should have. A simple piece of paper. Amazing how much truth can fit on one page. My phone buzzed again. This time it was Ethan. I let it ring, then again, then again. Finally, he left a voicemail. Dad, this isn't funny. Bring the Porsche back before you make things worse. Make things worse. I almost smiled. He still believed I was the unreasonable one. About 15 minutes later, my attorney called. Richard Benson and I had known each other for nearly 30 years. He'd handled every business contract, every property purchase, and eventually Linda's estate after she passed away. You sound tired, Richard said. I had an interesting Father's Day. I heard. You heard. The Scottsdale Police Department contacted me to verify ownership records after you listed me as the attorney of record. I laughed softly. So now my lawyer knows my son reported me for stealing my own car. I'm afraid so. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, Richard said, Daniel, I think we've reached the point where ignoring these problems isn't helping anyone. I know. I've actually been expecting this call. That surprised me. You have. You've spent years asking me not to say anything whenever Ethan crossed another line. He wasn't wrong. There had been plenty of lines. I just kept erasing them. The first time should have been enough. 5 years earlier, Ethan had invited me to a charity fundraiser at a luxury resort in Scottsdale. I remember standing beside him while he introduced me to a real estate developer. This is my dad. Nothing unusual there. Then the developer admired the Porsche parked near the entrance. Beautiful car. Ethan smiled proudly. Thanks. Just one word. Thanks. Not, it's my father's. Just thanks. The conversation moved on before I could correct anyone. Later that evening, I mentioned it. You forgot to tell him whose car it was. Ethan laughed. Dad, does it really matter? It isn't about the car. Exactly. He hugged me before leaving. I knew you'd understand. And because I wanted peace, I let it go. Then came the vacation home. Linda and I had purchased a small lake house years earlier. Nothing extravagant. Just somewhere peaceful where we'd spend weekends fishing, reading, and escaping the Arizona heat. After she died, I visited less often, so Ethan's family started using it. Again, I was happy they enjoyed it. Until one summer afternoon, I arrived unexpectedly with groceries. As I walked toward the deck, I heard Ethan talking with another couple. "You should see this place during Christmas. It's basically our second home." "Our, not Dad's, ours." Ashley immediately added, "We'll probably renovate the kitchen after everything becomes official." Official, I stepped onto the deck. Everyone smiled. No one explained what she'd meant. On the drive home, I convinced myself she'd simply misspoken. Looking back, she hadn't. She'd simply revealed how they already viewed my future, not as something uncertain, as something they already owned. The biggest warning came almost 2 years ago. Harper Climate Solutions celebrated its 40th anniversary. We hosted a company picnic for employees and their families. Toward the end of the afternoon, one of our senior technicians congratulated Ethan. "Must feel good knowing you'll take over someday." Before I could answer, Ethan nodded. "I'm looking forward to putting my own stamp on things." My own stamp. I watched several longtime employees exchange quick glances. Some looked confused, others looked uncomfortable. Because they knew something Ethan apparently didn't. I'd never promised him the company. I assumed we'd discuss succession when I was ready. He'd assumed it was automatic. That realization sat in my chest like a stone. Still, I stayed quiet. Again. Richard interrupted my thoughts. "Daniel, I'm here." "You've been silent." I was remembering all the times I should have spoken. "You can't change those." "No, but I can stop creating new ones." Richard sighed with relief. "I was hoping you'd say that." By early evening, I drove home. The Father's Day decorations were gone. The catering trucks had left. Only a few balloons remained tied to the mailbox, drifting lazily in the hot breeze. Inside the house, everything felt exactly as Linda had left it years before. Her favorite photographs. Her piano. The quilt she'd sewn by hand. I walked into my study and unlocked the fireproof cabinet. Inside sat every important document I'd accumulated over 4 decades. Business records, trust documents, property deeds, investment accounts, insurance policies, and one thick folder labeled estate plan. I laid it on the desk. Linda and I had written most of it together. Back when we imagined growing old surrounded by grateful grandchildren. Back when entitlement wasn't part of our vocabulary. I turned the pages slowly. Everything flowed to Ethan. The business, the lake house, several investment accounts, family heirlooms, generous provisions because I believed generosity would strengthen family bonds. Instead, maybe it had weakened something more important. Responsibility. The phone rang again. Richard. "I've been thinking," he said. "Dangerous habit," he chuckled. "I have an opening tomorrow morning." "For what?" "I think it's time we review every single document in that estate plan." I looked down at the folder resting on my desk. For years, I'd treated it like a promise. Maybe it was time to treat it like a responsibility. "I'll be there." 9 o'clock. "I won't be late." After hanging up, I closed the folder and rested my hand on top of it. Outside, the desert sky was turning orange. Inside, something else was changing. For the first time in years, I wasn't planning how to protect my son's feelings. I was planning how to protect the values Linda and I had spent a lifetime building. And somehow, that felt like the harder act of love. At exactly 9 o'clock Monday morning, I walked into Richard Benson's office carrying a leather folder that suddenly felt heavier than it ever had before. Not because the papers inside weighed anything, because every page represented a promise I'd made years ago to my late wife, to my son, and to the future I thought our family would share. Richard stood as I entered. He'd known me long enough to skip small talk. "You sleep at all?" he asked. "A couple of hours." "Coffee." "I've already had 2. He nodded toward the conference table. "Then let's get started." The room was quiet except for the soft hum of the air conditioner. For 30 years, I'd sat in that same room signing business contracts, purchasing commercial properties, and making plans to expand Harper Climate Solutions. Never once had I imagined that one day I'd be sitting there deciding whether my own son deserved to inherit the company I'd spent 4 decades building. Richard opened my estate file. "Before we discuss changes," he said, "I need to ask you one question." I looked at him. "Are you doing this because you're angry?" I didn't answer immediately. That question deserved honesty. Finally, I shook my head. If I were angry, I'd cut him out of everything. "And are you planning to do that?" "No." Richard leaned back. "Then why are we here?" I looked through the office window toward the busy Scottsdale street below. Cars came and went. People hurried to work. Life kept moving. I think I've confused love with enabling. He didn't interrupt. So many times I told myself I was helping Ethan. Every time I rescued him financially, every time I overlooked his arrogance, every time I stayed silent instead of correcting him, I called it love. I paused. Maybe it wasn't. Richard folded his hands. What do you think it was? Fear. Fear of what? That if I stopped fixing his problems, he'd stop loving me. The words surprised even me. I'd never admitted them aloud. Richard gave me a sad smile. Daniel, that's a fear a lot of parents carry. I know. But I also know Linda would have called me stubborn. He laughed softly. She probably would have. We spent the next 3 hours reviewing every section of my estate plan. The first document involved Harper Climate Solutions. Richard slid it toward me. Current language transfers controlling ownership directly to Ethan. I stared at the page. For years, I'd never questioned it. Back when Ethan was 25, ambitious, hardworking, and grateful, it had seemed obvious. That young man still existed somewhere. I hoped he did. But the man who'd publicly wished I'd never been his father wasn't ready to lead 80 families whose mortgages depended on that company. I want to change it. Richard nodded. To whom? Create an employee ownership trust. He raised an eyebrow. You're serious? I am. Harper Climate Solutions wasn't built by me alone. It had been built by technicians who crawled through attics in August, dispatchers who answered emergency calls at 2 a.m, managers who stayed during recessions instead of chasing bigger paychecks. Those people deserve security, not uncertainty. We'll structure it carefully, Richard said. Ethan, he can still work there if he earns it. Richard smiled slightly. That sounds like your first boundary. It probably is. Next came the lake house. Linda loved that place more than anywhere else. Our grandchildren had learned to fish off that little dock. Every Christmas we'd gathered around the stone fireplace. Richard looked up, keeping it in the family. I thought for a long moment, then I smiled. No, I want it donated. He looked surprised. To whom? A veterans retreat organization. Years earlier, Linda had volunteered with wounded veterans adjusting to civilian life. She always dreamed of giving them a peaceful place to heal. We'd never gotten around to it. Maybe now we finally could. Richard wrote notes. I think she'd approve. So do I. The investment accounts came next. Instead of passing everything directly to Ethan, I established an education foundation in Linda's name. Scholarships for students entering skilled trades, electricians, HVAC technicians, plumbers, carpenters, people willing to build something with their hands. The kind of people America never seems to appreciate until the air conditioner quits in July. Richard looked at me. This is quite a change. I'm not taking money away from my son. No, I'm putting purpose ahead of entitlement. He nodded. That's a different thing. When we finally finished, Richard removed his glasses. One more question. Go ahead. If Ethan sincerely changes, years from now, can these documents change again? Without hesitation, I answered. Absolutely. He looked relieved. So this isn't revenge. I smiled. No. This is accountability. That afternoon, I drove home feeling strangely peaceful. Not happy, not victorious, just lighter. For the first time in years, my decisions weren't driven by guilt. When I pulled into my driveway, another vehicle was already parked there. Ashley's white SUV, and beside it, the Porsche wasn't there. Of course it wasn't. I was driving it. As I stepped out, the front door swung open. Ethan stormed outside before I reached the porch. There you are. His face was red, his jaw clenched. You embarrassed me in front of the police. I didn't call them. You knew exactly what would happen. I knew the truth would happen. Ashley appeared behind him, arms folded. This whole thing is childish. I looked at her calmly. Reporting someone for stealing their own car is childish. She rolled her eyes. You know what I mean. No, I don't. Ethan stepped closer. Just sign the title over. The words hung in the air. I blinked. I'm sorry of the car. You've basically given it to me already. No. I've been driving it for 2 years. Borrowing it. Same difference. No, Ethan. I spoke quietly. It isn't. He laughed bitterly. You've always treated it like mine. I let you use it. You left it at our house. Because I trusted you. Exactly. I looked into my son's eyes. No, not exactly. I walked past him into my study. Both of them followed. From the fireproof cabinet, I removed a thin folder. Without saying a word, I placed several papers on the dining room table. The original purchase agreement, registration, insurance declaration, title. Every document carried one name. Mine. Ethan stared at them. Ashley picked one up. Her confidence began fading. This? She looked at Ethan. It's really in his name. It always has been, I said. No, Ethan insisted. There has to be. There isn't. He kept flipping through the papers as if another version might magically appear. Finally, he looked up. So you've been lying to me? I almost couldn't believe what I'd heard. Lying? You let me think. I let you borrow my car. I never once told you it was yours. You just... His voice faded. You assumed. The room became very quiet. Ashley broke the silence first. So what now? I slid the documents back into their folder. Now, I closed the cabinet. I think we're finished discussing the Porsche. Ethan took a deep breath. You can't seriously be ending our relationship over a car. I turned slowly. This stopped being about the car the moment you stood in front of your children and wished you'd never had me as your father. For the first time since Father's Day, he didn't have an answer. After Ethan and Ashley left, the house became painfully quiet. I walked out onto the back patio where we'd celebrated Father's Day only 2 days earlier. The balloons had deflated. A paper banner that read "World's Best Dad" still hung crookedly across the pergola, one corner flapping gently in the afternoon breeze. I stared at it for a long time. The irony would have been funny if it hadn't hurt so much. I finally climbed onto a chair and took it down. As I folded the paper carefully, I remembered my youngest granddaughter handing it to me with the biggest smile. "Mommy helped me make it," she'd said. Children rarely understand the battles adults create around them. I hoped they never would. Wednesday morning, I arrived at Harper Climate Solutions before sunrise. Retirement had given me the freedom to stay away, but I still visited every Wednesday for breakfast with the management team. The smell of fresh coffee and machine oil had always made me feel at home. As I walked through the office, several employees greeted me. "Morning, Mr. Harper. Good to see you." Nothing seemed different until I reached my office. Linda's photograph sat exactly where I'd always kept it. I smiled at the picture. I finally stopped pretending everything's okay. Somehow, saying those words aloud made me feel closer to her. About an hour later, my operations manager, Mike Sullivan, knocked on the open door. Mike had worked beside me for 27 years. I'd watched his children grow up. He'd stood beside me at Linda's funeral. He wasn't just an employee. He was family in every way except blood. "You got a minute?" he asked. "Always." He stepped inside but didn't sit. "I heard about Sunday." News traveled fast, especially in family businesses. "I figured you would." Mike looked uncomfortable. I wasn't trying to pry. "I know," he hesitated. "Some of the guys are worried." "About what?" "They've always assumed Ethan would eventually take over." "So did Ethan." Mike let out a slow breath. I wasn't going to say anything. But some people have been nervous about that for a while. That caught my attention. "What do you mean?" Mike chose his words carefully. "He doesn't know the business." "I know. He talks like he already owns it." "I know. And sometimes..." Mike stopped himself. "Go ahead. He treats the office like it's beneath him." I leaned back quietly. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" Mike gave me a sad smile. "Because nobody wanted to come between a father and his son." There it was again. Silence. Everyone had been protecting my feelings, just as I'd been protecting Ethan's. Together, we'd built a wall around the truth. That afternoon, I received 3 phone calls from relatives. The first was my younger sister, Karen. "I heard you and Ethan had a little disagreement." "A little?" She laughed nervously. "That's what Ashley called it." "I wouldn't." Karen sighed. "Daniel, families say awful things sometimes." "I know. You should just apologize." I blinked. "For what?" "For leaving the party. I left after my son wished I'd never been his father." "I know, but..." "No, Karen." I wasn't angry, just tired. There isn't a but after that sentence. She became quiet. I guess I hadn't thought about it that way. I've spent years thinking about everyone else's feelings. What about yours? I just started. The second call came from my cousin Frank. Unlike Karen, Frank never softened his opinions. "You really changed the locks on the lake house." "I did." "You trying to punish the kid?" "No." "Then why?" "Because it isn't his house." Frank chuckled. "Fair enough." "I also changed the security codes." You expecting trouble? I wasn't. He laughed. Now I think you might. The third call surprised me the most. It came from Pastor Michael. Linda and I had attended the same church for almost 30 years. I've spoken with Ethan. I closed my eyes. I figured you might. He says you're trying to destroy his future. What do you think? I think there's usually more than one version of every family conflict. I appreciate that. There was a brief silence. Then he asked something no one else had. Daniel, have you forgiven him? I looked out the window toward the parking lot. Forgiveness. People often confuse it with surrender. I don't hate my son. I know. I forgave him the moment I realized how lost he is. But forgiveness doesn't erase consequences. Pastor Michael smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. By Friday afternoon, something unexpected happened. The truth started spreading on its own. Not because I told anyone, because facts have a way of traveling without help. One of the Scottsdale officers who'd handled the Porsche report happened to know a customer of ours. That customer mentioned the misunderstanding to another business owner. Soon people realized Ethan had reported his own father for stealing a vehicle that legally belonged to his father. Nobody mocked him. They simply stopped believing the image he'd spent years creating. At the country club, people quietly discovered the Porsche wasn't his. Then someone mentioned the lake house belonged to me. Another person pointed out that I'd paid for Ethan's office building lease during his first 2 years in business. Within days, the illusion began falling apart. Not because I exposed him, because reality finally caught up with him. Late Saturday afternoon, Ashley arrived at my house alone. I almost didn't answer the door. When I did, she wasn't dressed in her usual designer clothes. No makeup, no sunglasses. She looked exhausted. We need to talk. I'm not sure we do. This isn't about the Porsche. What is it about? She hesitated. Ethan. I invited her inside. She remained standing. I didn't know the car wasn't his. I believe you. I honestly thought you'd already given it to him. I never said that. No, she looked down. You didn't. For the first time since I'd known her, Ashley seemed genuinely embarrassed. I think, she struggled to continue. I think we both started believing things that were never true. I encouraged him. She took a shaky breath. I kept telling him everything would eventually belong to us. The honesty caught me off guard. I thought I was motivating him. She laughed bitterly. Maybe I was feeding his ego. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, she whispered, He hasn't slept since Father's Day. Neither have I. She nodded slowly. He's blaming everyone. And you? I'm starting to think. She wiped away a tear. The only person he should have blamed was himself. Before leaving, she turned around. I don't know if he'll ever admit it. I answered honestly. I don't know either. After she drove away, I stood on the porch watching the sun disappear behind the Arizona mountains. For the first time all week, I sensed the cracks forming in the wall Ethan had built around himself. Not because I'd torn it down, because the truth had. The next afternoon, my doorbell rang again. This time when I opened it, Ethan was standing there, alone. No Ashley, no anger, no excuses. Just a man who suddenly looked much older than 38. When I opened the front door, Ethan stood there with his hands in his pockets. For the first time in years, he wasn't wearing an expensive watch. His designer sunglasses were gone. His shirt was wrinkled. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in days. Neither of us spoke. Finally, he cleared his throat. Can I come in? I stepped aside. You don't need permission to enter your father's house. The words hung between us. Your father's house, not yours, not ours, mine. He nodded quietly and walked inside. I led him to the kitchen where Linda and I had shared thousands of cups of coffee over nearly 40 years of marriage. Without asking, I poured 2 mugs. He smiled faintly. You still remember how I take it? 2 sugars. You never forgot. I've forgotten plenty of things. He lowered his eyes. I know. For several minutes, we sat in silence. It wasn't an angry silence. It was the kind that comes when 2 people finally realize they can no longer hide behind rehearsed arguments. Ethan looked around the kitchen. Everything's still the same. I like it that way. You never remodeled after Mom passed. No. You could have. I didn't want a different kitchen. He nodded. I guess I understand. Another silence. Then he surprised me. I'm sorry. The words were barely louder than a whisper. I looked at him carefully. Which part? He frowned. What do you mean? I've heard people say I'm sorry because they got caught. I took a sip of coffee. I've also heard people say it because they finally understood what they did. So, I met his eyes. Which kind is this? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he rubbed both hands over his face. I honestly don't know. That was the first honest thing he'd said in a very long time. I've been angry with you for years, he admitted. I know. I blamed you for everything. For what? He laughed bitterly. For always being successful. I blinked. He continued before I could respond. No matter what I did, people compared me to you. Your dad built a great company. Your dad is respected. Your dad takes care of everybody. I got tired of hearing it. I leaned back quietly. So you decided to become me. He looked down. I guess. When did that happen? I don't know. He stared into his coffee. Maybe after Mom died. His voice cracked. Everything changed after that. Mine did too. Losing Linda had hollowed out both of us. The difference was, I buried myself in gratitude. Ethan buried himself in resentment. I kept thinking, he continued, that if people believed I already had everything, they'd stop asking why I hadn't built anything myself. Those words hit me harder than Father's Day ever had. Not because they excused his behavior, because they explained it. He took a deep breath. You remember the charity gala? I do. When everyone thought the Porsche was mine, I nodded. I should have corrected them. You should have. I wanted them to think I was successful. Were you? He smiled sadly. No, I was pretending. He shook his head. Every year it got easier. The lake house, the Porsche, the company, the country club. I never actually lied. No, you just stopped telling the truth. He nodded slowly. Exactly. I looked at my son for a long moment. Ethan, when you were 8 years old, he smiled faintly. I know. You made me a Father's Day card. He laughed. You kept it. I still have it. I walked into my study and returned with a small wooden box. Inside were decades of memories, kindergarten drawings, little league trophies, family vacation photographs, birthday cards. Near the bottom lay a folded piece of construction paper. The edges had faded. Crayon letters covered the front. My dad is my hero. I handed it to him. He unfolded it carefully. His hands began trembling. I remember this. You misspelled hero. He laughed through tears. You never corrected me. I knew what you meant. He stared at the card for nearly a minute. I don't know where that little boy went, I answered quietly. I don't think he disappeared. I think he got buried. Ethan wiped his eyes. Ashley left. What? She's staying with her sister. I stayed silent. We've barely spoken since Sunday. He sighed. She said something that really hurt. What she said, he swallowed hard. I married a man who wanted to inherit a life instead of building one. I looked at him. Was she wrong? He closed his eyes. No. For nearly 2 hours we talked. Really talked. Not as opponents, as father and son. He admitted that his business wasn't doing nearly as well as everyone believed. He'd borrowed money to maintain appearances, luxury vacations, country club dues, private school tuition, the expensive clothes. Every image he'd tried so hard to project had become another bill he couldn't afford. I thought once I inherited everything, he stopped. I'd finally catch up. I leaned forward. That's the trap, son. What is living tomorrow with money you haven't earned today? He nodded slowly. I know that now. He looked toward the hallway. Did you really change your will? I did. His shoulders dropped. I deserve that. I didn't do it to punish you. I know. I did it because inheritance should never replace character. He looked at me. Can it ever change back? I answered honestly. Yes. Hope flashed across his face. Then I finished my sentence. When trust changes. His expression softened. That's fair. No, it's necessary. Before leaving, Ethan stood in the doorway. I don't expect things to go back to normal. They won't. I don't expect the Porsche. You won't get it. He actually smiled. I figured. I don't expect the company. You may still have a place there. He looked surprised. As an employee, not an heir. If you earn everyone's respect, the future can take care of itself. He nodded. I think. He took a slow breath. For the first time in my life, I'm actually going to have to build something. I smiled. Your mother would have liked hearing that. His eyes filled again. So would I. He walked down the driveway without looking back. Not because he was angry, because he was thinking. For months afterward, I heard very little from him. No demands, no late-night arguments, no angry texts, just silence. But this silence felt different. It wasn't the silence of pride. It was the silence of someone doing difficult work where nobody else could see. And sometimes, those are the most important battles a person ever fights. The next year passed more quietly than any year since Linda died. There were no dramatic confrontations, no courtroom battles, no family members screaming across holiday dinner tables. Real life rarely works that way. Real change usually happens in ordinary mornings, small decisions and long stretches of silence where nobody is applauding. During those 12 months, Ethan never asked about the Porsche again. He never mentioned the estate. He never asked whether I'd change the trust back. Instead, he did something I'd been hoping to see for almost 20 years. He went to work. Not for me, for himself. A few weeks after our conversation, he accepted a management position with a regional building supply company in Phoenix. The salary wasn't glamorous. The benefits were average. For the first time since college, no one hired him because of my last name. He earned the job through 3 interviews and a practical skills assessment. When he told me that over the phone, I heard something in his voice I hadn't heard since he was a teenager. Pride, real pride, not borrowed, earned. I almost walked away during the second interview, he admitted one evening. Why? I thought they were going to reject me. What happened? They asked me what I'd accomplished on my own. I smiled. What did you say? I was honest. And I told them I was still figuring that out. He laughed softly. I guess honesty sounds different when you've spent years pretending. Ashley and Ethan separated for several months. I stayed out of it. Marriage belongs to the 2 people inside it, not the parents standing outside. One afternoon, Ashley called and asked whether we could meet for lunch. I agreed. She looked very different from the confident woman who'd walked into my house expecting me to hand over the Porsche title. There was humility in her eyes now. I'm not here to defend myself, she said after we ordered. I appreciate that. She stirred her iced tea without looking at me. I've spent a year blaming Ethan. She finally looked up. But I wasn't innocent. I nodded. I know. I kept pushing him to compete with people who didn't even know he existed. She laughed bitterly. I cared too much about appearances. We both made mistakes. She looked surprised. You still think you made mistakes? I do. Howie, I gave too much? I paused and expected gratitude to teach responsibility. She thought about that for a long time. Do you think people can really change? I smiled. I think people change when pretending becomes more painful than telling the truth. She quietly wiped away a tear. I hope you're right. Months later, she and Ethan began counseling together. They didn't magically fix everything, but they stopped pretending there wasn't anything to fix. Sometimes that's where healing begins. Meanwhile, Harper Climate Solutions continued growing. The employee ownership trust became official. Some people thought I'd made a strange decision. Others said I was giving away too much. They didn't understand. The company had never belonged to one man. It belonged to generations of people who had answered emergency calls during Arizona summers when families desperately needed air conditioning. At our annual company picnic, I announced the new ownership structure. The employees didn't cheer immediately. Most of them simply stared at me. Then Mike Sullivan stood up. I've worked here 28 years. His voice shook. I've never seen a boss thank his employees this way. One by one, the technicians began clapping. Not for me, for one another. That meant more than any award I'd ever received. About 10 months after Father's Day, I received an unexpected visitor. It was my oldest grandson, Noah. He was 13 now, old enough to notice when adults weren't speaking. He climbed onto the porch swing beside me. Grandpa. Yeah, buddy, Dad's different. I smiled. He is. He doesn't yell anymore. No. He even sold his fancy watch, I laughed. I heard. Noah looked toward the backyard. He says we're not joining the country club again. How do you feel about that? He shrugged. I kind of like fishing better. I smiled. So did your grandma. He looked at me curiously. Dad says you taught him something. What was that? He thought for a moment. He said, borrowed success disappears. Earned success stays. I looked toward the Arizona sky. I wish I'd taught him that sooner. Then Father's Day arrived again. This time there were no caterers, no expensive decorations, no oversized celebration meant to impress anyone. Just hamburgers on the grill, potato salad, fresh lemonade, my grandchildren running through the backyard with a sprinkler. Exactly the kind of day Linda loved most. Around noon, an old blue Ford pickup pulled into the driveway. Not new, not polished, just clean and well cared for. Ethan climbed out wearing faded jeans and work boots. I walked toward him. You traded the luxury SUV. I did. You like the truck. I paid cash. He smiled. First vehicle I've ever owned without anybody else's help. I reached out and squeezed his shoulder. I'm proud of you. He looked away for a second. I've wanted to hear that my whole life. You always could have. I know. I just thought I had to impress you first. You never did. After lunch, Ethan handed me a small wrap package. It isn't expensive. It doesn't have to be. Inside was a simple wooden picture frame. The photograph showed Linda, Ethan, and me standing beside our very first company truck almost 35 years earlier. I'd forgotten the picture even existed. On the back of the frame, he'd written a note in careful handwriting. Dad. For years, I confused receiving with earning. I thought inheritance would make me successful. You taught me that character comes first. Thank you for loving me enough to stop rescuing me. Happy Father's Day. Love, Ethan. I read it twice before I could speak. Then I hugged my son. Not because everything had been forgotten. It hadn't. Not because trust had completely returned. Trust takes time. I hugged him because for the first time in many years, I wasn't embracing the man he pretended to be. I was embracing the man he was becoming. As the afternoon drifted on, my grandchildren laughed in the backyard while Ethan flipped burgers beside me. At one point, he looked toward the garage. The Porsche still runs, I chuckled. Like a dream. He grinned. Good. Want to take it for a drive sometime? He shook his head. No. You sure? I'm waiting. For what? He smiled. Until I can buy one myself. I laughed so hard I had to wipe tears from my eyes. There he is. Who? My son. Looking back now, people sometimes ask whether reporting my Porsche stolen was the worst thing Ethan ever did. It wasn't. The worst thing was believing that another person's success could become his own simply by standing close enough to it. The best thing that happened wasn't changing my estate plan. It wasn't keeping the Porsche. It wasn't proving I was legally right. The best thing that happened was watching my son discover that dignity can't be inherited. It has to be earned. If this story reminds you of someone you love, or perhaps even yourself, I hope you'll remember this. Love should be generous, but it should also be wise. Helping someone is a gift. Preventing them from growing is not. If this story touched your heart, consider sharing it with someone who may need to hear it. And if you enjoy stories about family forgiveness, accountability, and second chances, I'd be honored if you subscribed and joined me for the next one. Until then, take care of the people you love, and never wait until it's too late to tell them the truth.